Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm so happy to be sitting here with you today. So thank you so much for tuning in. Today's guest is a very special guest that I have planned for you. But before we get to that, I definitely want to review some housekeeping. So there's been a little bit of delay of releasing podcasts, and there's been a lot going on behind the scenes. So please note, there have been some issues, but we should be back on schedule soon. The part 2 of the suicide in relationships, or how suicidal ideation is utilized in relationships with narcissists, has yet to be released. So there is a bit of a delay on that podcast. So please note that it is coming out very soon. Also, if you want support from those who are recovering from toxic and abusive relationships, please come on over to A Date with Darkness Facebook group, where you can join the support of those who are also healing from their relationships, and they need your support, and they are there to provide support to you as well. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns about the podcast, please email me at adatewithdarkness@gmail.com. And there are going to be some changes coming up to the podcast. However, I will hold off on making those announcements until we are fully ready to move forth with that. And now, without further ado, today's guest is Miss Nancy Allen. She is a coach for survivors of incest. She also has her own podcast, A Tale of the Bell. And today's show is a confessional with Nancy Allen, where she talks about her personal experience with familial incest and how she worked to overcome that, and what avenues that led her to later on down the road in her life. So I say this to preface up front, if you know that this is a sensitive topic for you, you may want to skip today's episode, or you may even want to listen to it in sections, whatever's easier for you. Because this can be a difficult topic for many of us to handle, but we don't go too much in depth about her experiences with the incest, but rather her experiences around the incest, if that makes sense. So without further ado, here's the interview with Nancy. Hello, Nancy, and welcome to the show.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well, and I appreciate having you on. So it's such a pleasure to have you on as a guest. And for those of my listeners who are not familiar with you, can you talk a little bit about you, who you are, and what drives the passion behind the work you do?
So sure. So I am I guess I'm a coach for very specifically, I work with incest survivors. And even more fine-tuned than that, I work with incest survivors who have gone through therapy and are really looking for community to help so that they don't feel so different and alone. And I do that based on my own prior experience, because I am a father-daughter incest survivor as well.
Okay. And so tell us a little bit about what an incest survivor is, for those who may not be as familiar as what that is or what that means?
So an incest survivor, it can be very broadly or defined, but it generally is generally a sexual relationship between family members. And in this case, what I'm referring to is child sexual abuse by a family member to a child within the family. So it could be father-daughter, mother to daughter, it could be father to son, it could be siblings, it could be an uncle, grandparent. Um, but in all instances where I'm referring to as incest survivors, I'm referring to the child having no control.
Right. Okay. And so you've had your own experience with being an incest survivor, which is, part of the reason why you wanted to come on the show, because you wanted
Mm-hmm.
to share your own experience, right?
Mm-hmm. But I think my motivations are a little bit broader than just sharing my own experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I look at part of my own personal experience was I spent a lot of time feeling very different, isolated, alone, and ashamed
Mm,
of my past. And it's not something that anyone should have to feel that way. And
mm,
so I'm really trying to, in some ways, break through the stigma of being a survivor and raising awareness that it's okay, that it's not your shame, that it's the perpetrator's shame.
mm-hmm.
So um, I really think it's more about being able to ensure that survivors that are out there that may be just kind of getting through things know that they're not alone and that there are people that understand.
Absolutely. And can you share a bit about your experience in being an incest survivor, kind of like what your experience was, maybe a little bit about how your childhood was overall, and, just kind of how long you went through your experience, as you say, alone.
Yeah. So I'm now in my mid 50s, and my abuse began when I was about 12. I was physically abused prior to that, but I
Mm-hmm.
grew up in an upper middle class home. My father was a podiatrist, my mother was a nurse practitioner,
Mm-hmm.
and um, I have 7 brothers and sisters. So we were a pretty tight knit um, Catholic family, but at the same time, very much a family that didn't have a lot of outside interests
Mm.
and um, really kind of had focused in on itself. So I
Okay.
was about 12 when the sexual abuse started by my father. And I was 14 actually when it was actually reported to Child Protective Services. And that was a whole process that happened.
Mm.
Um, but in the process of being reported to Child Protective Services, I was in an emergency foster care placement for just 2 nights, but then went to court, and my parents were there, their attorneys, the Child Protective Service was there, my older siblings were there, and the judge. And I can remember at 14 being called to stand before a judge and being asked to very specifically describe what had happened in
Mm.
front of my parents, in front of my father, open court.
Yeah.
Of course, at that point in time, this is 1978, so at that
Yeah.
time they didn't understand. And um,
Mm.
so it was almost kind of being re-abused by the system,
I can
or
imagine.
certainly
Mm.
re-traumatized by the system. But that
Mm.
opened the door to a lot more, because what ended up happening from that is that he was pulled from the home. I was pulled from the home. He was ordered into therapy, and I was ordered into therapy. And the result of all of that was I saw it as we both got the same punishment. I was equally at fault. And I had that reaffirmed for me by a few other areas. A Catholic priest, basically, that I had spoken to, basically gave me my penance. I had my grandmother basically tell
Mm.
me, just don't entice him. And say, well, he never had any other punishment for basically what's a crime. And so
Yeah.
I
Wow.
am, having been pulled, I spent the summer with my oldest sister in a kinship foster care placement.
Mm-hmm.
And having been pulled in through that experience, I pretty much really felt that the whole disclosure component was as bad, if not worse, than
Okay.
the actual abuse. And so I never said anything again. And so as a result of that, it actually continued and escalated into my early 20s. So there was opportunity here for intervention that really didn't happen because at the time,
Absolutely.
yeah,
So, can you go back for a minute? I would be interested, if you could share about who reported the issue
sure.
to Child
Yeah, so
Protective Services and a little bit more about what that process was like for you.
sure. So I was 12 when it started, and around I just turned 14, so I'm in eighth grade, and just finishing up my eighth grade school year. And my father used to abuse me during the day when other people weren't around, and then it kind of shifted to night. But he was a podiatrist, and I worked in his office and his practice with him at times. And so the summer was coming, and I was really getting nervous and scared about
Mm,
being more available to him.
mm,
I had managed the school year by pretty much spending a lot of time hiding in the attic, literally, um, and waiting for somebody else to come home to ensure that I was not in the home by myself with him. So I spent a lot of time focusing on reading books, doing homework, that kind of stuff, because I found that for me, I was able to really focus and
mm,
distract, which is a little different than a lot of folks. So my addictive behavior, if you will, or my escape was through studying and then later through work, which had its positive benefits. I was then became kind of a teacher's pet. And got nurturing through my teachers. But so all of this was going on, and I basically had some behavior changes that a teacher picked up on
okay.
because I was nervous and scared about now spending a lot more time with him in his office one-on-one.
What were your
And
behavior changes? Can you talk about those?
I honestly don't, I can't really state or say, but I am assuming that I was withdrawing,
Okay.
really being depressed, and a teacher had picked up on it, and just not my normal kind of engaged type self.
Mm-hmm.
So she reported it to a guidance counselor who was a male, who basically spent a couple of sessions with me where I would just refuse to talk. And so he then said, okay, so maybe you'd be better off talking with a woman, and sent me to see a female guidance counselor from another school, which didn't help either. I mean, the whole thing came down to I was afraid to say anything because my father had basically sworn me to secrecy kind of thing, and basically had said that if I had said something, people wouldn't understand, they would break up the family, and it would be my fault.
Mm,
So uh, eventually, that guidance counselor suggested that I go to therapy, and I did. And during a period where I was actually visiting my oldest sister, who was 8 years older than me, she had her own apartment, and she basically asked me what was I going to therapy for, and I basically, and I don't know why, but for some reason I trusted her and I felt safe in telling her. And so I wrote her a note as I was leaving and basically told her what my father was doing. And she then took the note and called my therapist, who we got back with. She exposed it to my therapist. And
mm-hmm.
what she had said to me was that she was really sorry for me because she really thought that he had stopped, and he had promised her that he had stopped with her. So basically, in all in one swoop, it became a disclosure that he was not just with me, that he had been doing this to her for a long period before that.
Wow. Okay. And so your counselor was the one who actually made the report.
Yes. And so this is 1978. So it's the first year
Sure.
of mandatory reporting in the state
Okay.
that I was.
What
Yeah.
was that like? Was that something that she actually sat down with you and explained that to you and
I
did
didn't
you ever
honestly
discuss that?
feel that, I mean, she did explain, but I took it as it was snowballing out of control. I had no say in
Yeah.
anything
Yeah.
around what would happen from there, about anything that I wanted. Decisions were being made for me, and I had no control.
Mm. When did you start to get that feeling that things were just sort of snowballing and it was way out of control?
I think Well, I think it was probably starting from, when the teacher intervened with the guidance counselor, and it just
Okay.
kind of got worse and worse from there, because
Mm-hmm.
again, it's like I'm not saying anything, and I'm not saying anything specifically because I don't want this to come out,
Mm.
and there's all kinds of shame involved in all the kind of threats that my father was making at the time.
Mm. And so the report was filed.
Hmm.
What happened from there? Maybe can you talk a little bit about after the report was filed, what was sort of the timeline between the counselor filing the report and then there being some sort of notification in the home?
So the council filed the report. And that first night I spent with my sister where I was, and so nothing was told to my father or to the family. The social services came and interviewed me at my sister's house, and then they made a determination that we should be pulled. So that day, that following night, so the second night, the police were called, and they showed up at my parents' house. I was still with my sister, and my mother was away. My mother was traveling on a business trip, and my grandmother was staying at the house, who was my paternal grandmother.
Sure.
And so they went to the house to pick up my younger brother and sister, who were 3 years younger than me. They were twins, because of just the whole protective order. And they
Sure.
pulled the three of us. So I was 14 and they were 11. And we then went to the courthouse, where we were interviewed to make the claim. Again, I'm so overwhelmed, so that I couldn't even open my mouth. I couldn't speak at this point, because
Sure.
at this point it's absolutely snowballing. And my sister, the child protective services would not allow us to stay with my sister beyond that one night that we had, because it was my paternal grandmother's home. It was the second floor of her home, and so my father had access. So they decided that we should be placed into foster care.
Mm-hmm.
And so my sister tried calling a number of different relatives and friends and tried to find us a placement, at least for the night, and nobody would take us. And I remember listening to her on the payphone, literally calling people and trying to explain, and just being rejected after rejected. So
Oh,
we ended up being placed into an emergency foster
sure.
care home. And then the following, which was a crazy evening, and then the following day, I went to court while my younger brother and sister stayed at the foster home.
Okay. So was your father arrested?
No. So that was, I think, part of the
Yeah.
thing that set things up for me for the longer period, in that my father openly admitted to what he had done in court. He apologized to the court. And
Mm.
as a result of that, the only thing that happened to him was the same thing that happened to me. He was pulled from the home, and he was asked, so he lived in he had a 3-story family apartment complex where the first floor was his office, and he stayed there.
Okay.
And I was placed into a kinship foster care with my oldest sister and her husband, who had their own home. This is a different
Sure.
sister, so she's 9 years older than me. And he was ordered into therapy, and I was ordered into therapy. So as a result
Wow.
of that, I interpreted that as it was my fault as much as his,
Mm.
because we received the same punishment, is the way I viewed it.
Absolutely. Um, and I could see why you would feel that way. Did anyone know about the abuse while it was happening?
So the abuse with me while it was happening before court,
Yes.
no one knew that it was happening.
Okay.
My oldest sister had been abused for years as well, but the oldest, I have 2 older sisters. One is 9 years older than me, who was basically my kinship foster parent. And then I have one that is 8 years older than me, who
Sure.
actually helped report it. He did not touch my oldest sister,
Hmm.
but he spent years with my next oldest sister.
Okay. And so there had never been any inkling by your mother that he was being inappropriate or
Nobody
abusing
had ever told
you.
my mother. However, when my sister was involved with him, she actually told his brother, his only sibling, and his mother. And they both talked to him, and he basically told them that he wouldn't do anything again, and that was the end of it. And so it never went any further with my oldest sister until he came
Mm-hmm.
out with me.
Mm-hmm. And so when this issue got reported with you,
Mm-hmm.
what was the interactions like between your mom and then your siblings and yourself?
So the oldest sister that I was living with for the
Sure.
summer and my mother really tried to spend time disproving my oldest sister's claims. They didn't do that to me, but they did to my oldest sister, and I watched this. So there was this
Mm.
lots of confusion. They really felt that she was exaggerating things and really trying to set up to disprove a bunch of what she was saying.
Wow.
For me, there wasn't that kind of a response. The response was, particularly because he admitted it in court and he
Mm-hmm.
apologized for it.
Okay.
Um, so it was harder to say that it didn't happen. And it wasn't that nobody believed that it didn't happen with me. It was more that the family didn't know what to do about it. And so the family was seeking therapy. And the therapist at that time, honestly, didn't know what to do about it. It wasn't, they really believed at that time that they could be cured. And I only spent maybe 5, 6 more sessions in therapy one on one. And then we did some family therapy. And the
Wow.
troubling thing was that my father originally had his own therapist at another location, and their insurance ran out. So he was picked up by the spouse of my therapist, who they were partners and worked together.
Hmm.
So it was one of these, how do I say anything? How do I trust anything? I had already said too much in my mind, and that by speaking, it had snowballed into something out of control that from my
Right.
perspective. So I wasn't elaborating. I was complacent and going along, but it certainly wasn't therapeutic for me.
Absolutely. And I could see why it would be strained at best or just very, very intimidating, just to say the least. And it sounds like the work was more towards reunification.
Yes,
So getting the two of you back together in the home.
the whole
It
family.
doesn't
Yep.
necessarily sound like there was an assessment for danger or violence to see if this was continue. And I don't really know, and maybe you could shed some light on this, if there was any sort of assessment towards your younger siblings to see if maybe they were potentially at risk also at that time.
So the three of us were actually placed out of the home, not just
Right.
me. And so there was an assessment for them as well, and they felt that just because of their age, that there was a potential for here.
Yeah.
So they pulled the three of us.
Right.
There was an assessment, and they really were focused on reunification. They really felt that because he was remorseful, he was accepting responsibility, that at that time they thought that that was enough. And he really
Yeah.
was in therapy and trying to work through things. Um, but it was at a time when, had I been able to actually share and talk, I might have gotten more from that, and it might have ended than what happened after that, but it
Meaning.
didn't. So after I was returned to the home, first of all, I wasn't asked if I was okay with it or if I wanted to.
Sure.
I would have said yes
Wow.
that I wanted to, but we were brought back at the same time. So he was and I was at the same time. So again, it's
Wow.
the reinforcement again of the belief that it's equally my fault kind of thing.
Hmm.
And it was at a time when it was the being pulled apart, the overwhelming components of being out of control, being away from friends, being away from everything that I knew, starting
Hmm.
high school, all of that. I basically said that I would never say anything again because it just wasn't worth it. The abuse was
Sure.
easier than the intervention.
Right.
So within 6 months of being returned home, I was pregnant with my father's child.
Wow. Okay. And you were how old at
I
that
was now
time?
I was now 15,
Okay.
and it was very public because I was on a school trip to Washington D.C. Um, and I just had a severe cramping, and so I was taken to the emergency room, and my teacher was with me, and was there that I was told that I was pregnant, and so there was this whole how do I get home because it was a flight away, and the response of my parents in terms of me coming home and being picked up on the bus, and teacher was expecting like an ambulance to be waiting at the airport kind of thing, and none of that happened. um, so it was during that time that I really kind of reinforced for me that I didn't have an ally in the family. My
Yeah.
father basically denied it at that point that he had done anything, and I hadn't even had a date yet. So to put that into context. And he basically was calling me all kinds of names, calling me a whore, calling me whatever. And my mother basically, I heard them talking, and I heard my mother basically telling him, just calm down. I'll deal with it in the morning. I'll take it to the clinic, and not really trying to address me and asking what had happened or anything along those lines. So again, I'm
Hmm.
feeling left out. I'm feeling
Absolutely.
at fault, and
Yeah.
just that relationship became I would never say anything again, and I didn't until after he died. And so
So I'm sorry.
no, okay,
Your mother never had a conversation with you.
no. And so I didn't see her as an ally after that at all. I never talked to her about really anything that was going on with me, and just found a way to cope.
And
Yeah.
I can see why. What did your sister, the one who had, called and made the initial report, did she circle back and have any additional conversations with you at all?
She tried to. I mean, she was very supportive of me and always had been. But through this, she was 8 years older than me, so she's in her early 20s.
Sure.
And she's starting her own life. He's being aggressive towards her. She was starting to date someone who he didn't approve of. She told the person that she was dating. It ended up in a situation where my father basically told her not to come back and threw her out, kind of thing, with contact with her. So really, he was trying to separate all ties of intervention, and really isolate us.
And it sounds like that worked. And
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting. It sounds like your mom did not have a discussion with him either.
Yeah, I really think so. Later on, my mother and I reconciled, and my mother was actually very supportive of me and helped me through a crisis after he died, when I was 28. But and I was suicidal at that point in time, and she really stepped up and helped me, and so we became friends because I really, through therapy at that point in time, therapy worked for me, and I called her on her lack of support, her allowing and things to continue. And I think in the ultimate situation here, she had an abusive situation herself, and she just didn't know what to do. There weren't the kind of resources that there are today at that point in time.
Hmm. Did they ultimately stay together until his passing?
Yes.
Okay. And so, did you notice any sort of discord between the two of them around this issue?
They weren't very, how do I put this? They were almost kind of cohabitating. My parents, I'd never remember my parents being affectionate towards each other. Um, so it was just kind of a situation where they were two parents in the home, but not really a couple.
Hmm.
So,
And it sounds like, what happened ultimately with the pregnancy?
so I think part of the reason that it came out the way that it came out, and I was, taken to the emergency room, is that I was miscarriaging, and that's
I
what was
see.
happening.
I
And
see.
yeah, so I believe that I lost the baby.
Did the dynamics change after that in the family
I
at
think what
all?
what happened for me basically was I really felt now at this point I'm completely alone. That there's no nothing's going to change to make this any better, that this is a situation of grin and bear it. And I needed to find outlets for whatever I needed to do.
What was that? Your outlets?
So at that point in time, actually, I met the boy who would ultimately become my husband. So we were 15, and he became my escape, as well as studying still for me was an absolute outlet. And because my father was a doctor, he valued education. So if I was studying, he would leave me alone. So that kind of reinforced that study component, which then kind of helped me later on in my career, and college, and actually ultimately being able to create a life for myself afterwards.
Absolutely. And that's good that you were able to develop that coping mechanism. And so it sounds like after everything, there was a period of kind of separation or disconnecting from your immediate family. Was it all related to this, or was there some other stuff kind of tied up into it?
So I don't think I was separating from them. I think I was compartmentalizing where physically I was there. I was connected to, at the time, my boyfriend. And the abuse continued until into my early 20s. And so it was this, and it kept escalating, to more torturous type things, because my father at some point shifted. I think he knew or realized that I would never say anything again. And as a result of that, he was more sadistic, and it's almost like evil opened up or something.
Yeah.
I can't even describe it, but
Wow.
yeah. So there wasn't so much the separation from family, because I also was very connected to my siblings. I had 2 younger, and so I'm one of 8. So there were still 5 of us at home in that time period. So
As you grew up or you grew older, did they have some thoughts or some discussions with you about what happened, your other siblings?
So not until literally when I was 28 years old and my father died, and everything exploded for me. And
Really?
I became, it's like the safety valve went off, and I was having nightmares and flashbacks, and I didn't understand what was happening. It was completely out of control, and I was suicidal. And he died on December 23rd. And by the second week in January, I was at a point where at that point in time, I had 2 children. They were 1 and 3 at the time. And I just couldn't, I remember sitting there with a bottle of pills, and I just couldn't go through with it, simply because I just saw my kids.
Yeah.
So I ended up calling for some emergency help. I found someone who would take me in that day. And then I basically was referred to an acute psychiatric hospital, which is where I ended up for a period of time. So during that time, though, my siblings were absolutely supportive and did whatever they could to help me. And part of that, I believe, is that he was gone. So the whole threat was gone, and we were able to help each other more. And my mother helped me then as well.
Was there some intimidation from him in terms of everyone else? Were they afraid of him?
I think we all were afraid of him, and then also very protective of him. So it was this kind of, I don't even know the dynamic that I'm trying to say, but it was not a single, he was always fearful, because I can honestly tell you that to this day, I have mixed feelings from my father, that I can say that I loved him and that I hated him. And so that's a concept that a lot of people struggle with.
Absolutely. So coming full circle then, and reflecting back on this whole thing, the reporting and all of that kind of stuff, what do you think about that now? You said you wished you never said anything and, all this other kind of stuff. Now that you've kind of lived in through your truth, what do you think about that experience now?
It's unfortunate that when there was opportunity, public opportunity to do something about it, that the court system failed me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one. And I guess knowing that it's hard to get arms around how did that happen? Why did that happen? I mean, who didn't do their job? I mean, I actually, when I was 28 and my father had died, as I said, my siblings really supported me. And in part of that therapy and healing, my siblings all signed off on obtaining both my father's therapy records, and my mother did as well as the
Wow.
Child Protective Services records. So was now able to go see what actually transpired,
Okay.
who did what. And it would just seem to be point after point of different people involved, and nobody really. I mean, my father was a charmer. He was one of these most very well respected people in the community, and people loved him. So it was hard to see him as something other than that side of him.
What did you discover in his records? Anything, if anything?
So his records, the hospital that he was seeing couldn't find them. But through his discussions with the Child Protective Services and that investigation, basically he came across as very dejected, very remorseful, very accepting that he had done it, and that he didn't understand why, and that he was trying to figure it out, and that he loved his kids. And so it's hard to say whether or not I truly believe that. I think at one level I do. But there was this other side to him that people just didn't see. And so I really think he was a sociopath, and just was manipulative. And so it was really hard to understand how much of it was lies, at all from him. And was there any truth to anything that he had ever said?
So, can you talk a little bit about why you wanted to share this experience? It's very just moving, and some would consider it to be heavy.
Yeah. So, again, when I was 28, he died. I spent about a year and a half really digging in, reassessing, putting relationships on my terms, stopping relationships with folks that didn't make sense. And I really felt like I had come through that recovery period. I spent the next 2 decades really thriving. My husband and I grew closer as a result of this. It became a situation where, in some ways, it was empowering, because I believed that if I can go through that, then there's pretty much not much that's going to be able to get in the way of whatever we wanted. I also began to understand the little moments were what was important, and to truly appreciate those little moments. So I didn't get overwhelmed by things that, things happened, life happened. Ended up adopting 2 children through the foster care system ourselves. And in that process, I actually had the Department of Social Services apologize to me for the way that they handled my case, which was very
interesting,
heartfelt. And it was helpful to actually hear them admit that, and it wasn't the same people, but still there was a recognition that they had failed, which was a good thing. So I spent 20 years or so really just kind of living, thriving, kind of put it in the past, had integrated it, didn't really talk about it much. I mean, it came up on occasion. But when I was 46 years old, I met another incest survivor. And for the first time in my life, started talking about it to someone other than a therapist. And at that time, it was like, believe me, I was loved. I had an amazing, incredible husband, family, and he empathized, he understood, he stood beside me through all of through therapy and healing. But he didn't truly understand. And so for the first time at 46, I met someone who not just empathized, but actually got me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel different, which was huge for me.
Mm-hmm.
So we were friends. And then at 49, so 3 years later, my husband died. Very suddenly, he died from suicide and
Wow.
his own issues, but it created a spiral for me. Overnight, I became a single parent of two traumatized children. My older two boys were able to come back and help a little bit. But at the same time, I'm grieving for him. My children are grieving. But on top of all of that, um, what I thought that I had dealt with suddenly just kind of roared back. And I didn't feel safe because my husband had been with me since I was 15.
Mm-hmm.
He was my outlet. He was what I viewed as what kept me safe. He was the one place that I truly felt like I could shut off
Mm-hmm.
and not be on guard. And all of a sudden that was gone. And I went back into nightmares. It was horrible.
Mm-hmm.
So I went back into therapy and worked through that, and then I relocated my family to another state. And that was 6 years ago. And after I had finished therapy and was looking for just more support as opposed to, reinvestigating and exploring, and really just wanted support as I kind of continued to rebuild and start my next chapter, I sought out other types of support groups, and I really didn't find anything. I found a Life After Loss group for widows and widowers, and I joined that, and they were very helpful. They were very warm and caring, and there was a lot of commonality. But generally speaking, I was younger because I was only 49. They tended to be older. I
Mm-hmm.
had children at home where most of them, their children were, grown. And my husband had died from suicide, which is an added complexity, and it was very sudden, so there was no preparation here. And then to top it all off, I'm dealing with incest again because I had to learn and understand that he was not what kept me safe. I kept me safe. He was my mirror. But having to understand that again, which I finally got to, but in the process of all of that, what it came out for me was how could 20 something years later, there still be very limited resources for survivors to find comfort and support from other survivors.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of drove me to, if it's not out there, why not me? How do I make this different? How do
Sure.
I step into this? And so
Mm.
I went back to school and I became a life coach. And I started Tell the Bell. And the
Yeah.
goal that I have really is to not have other incest survivors feel the way that I did, meaning feeling different, isolated, and alone.
Okay. What um, sort of advice do you have for incest survivors who do feel alone
I think,
and go through a tough situation? I mean, there's children, probably thousands of children that go through what you went through and a lot worse. And I'm not trying to compare apples to
mm-hmm,
oranges or anything like that, but the reality is, I'm quite sure there's a lot of children in the system that are misplaced, that are
mm-hmm,
molested, and even worse, those that are molested, and there's never any sort of intervention.
yeah.
What
So
sort of, yeah,
I think the advice that I would give to survivors is that you truly are not alone. That there
yes,
are all kinds of organizations out there today that are looking to make changes
yes,
in all kinds of levels. There's all kinds of more prevention programs that as I'm starting to do this and learn more about it, I'm actually finding a lot more happening with like Erin's Law, where where 38 states now have passed that there's mandatory sex education training within public school
mm-hmm.
systems about owning your own body, about openly talking about abuse with children, with their parents, and with the school, with the teachers. So there's that that's out there, and that to me is amazing. There are actual support groups. There's Incest Survivors Anonymous out there. There's a group called the Unique Foundation who puts on free retreats, 4-day retreats for adult survivors of child sexual abuse. And all you got to do is get yourself out there, and those programs are amazing. And so there's more out there trying to do more around prevention,
Mm-hmm.
and also to support survivors that are going through things. So I guess what I would really say is that you really are not alone, that there are resources available, and that there are people who do understand, and that there is life past this. This is not something that defines you.
Mm-hmm.
This is a piece of your past that you can integrate, and it's just one piece of your story.
Absolutely. Do you have resources in which you said the most helpful thing is to be with someone that had shared similar experiences? Do you have a group or people that you refer to that also share similar experiences that you would recommend?
So I guess what I do, first of all, if you're just starting out, I
Yeah,
highly recommend getting with a trauma-informed therapist. And
absolutely.
then getting it, because really therapy is what's going to help get through. You
Mm-hmm.
got to go back and look at it from an adult perspective, and go through seeing those childhood experiences as an adult.
Mm-hmm.
Really kind of reframes it for you and
Mm-hmm.
changes the narrative. So I think that's critical.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, I think that there are all kinds of support groups out there that are available too. I mean, I do coaching very specifically for incest survivors who
Mm-hmm.
have gone through therapy, that because they're in a point in their life where they don't necessarily need to dig into their past and understand it, but they need somebody to walk with them as they go through living life, what I call through a survivor's lens. And when I'm referring to that is things like, um, when you're parenting, how do you, first of all, you didn't have a good role model. So how do you support each other in parenting and learn those kinds of skills? How do you protect your children without being overly protective that they can't grow and be who they are and be, helicoptered, and then um, it's that kind of discussions with, and then practical tips just around pretty much any subject, sexual intimacy. Um, if how do you transition from, you're with your partner, he wants to get, intimate, and you're not quite ready. How do you communicate that if you can't talk it? It's it's practical tip type stuff that you don't
Absolutely.
necessarily cover in therapy. That's what I think that you get from other survivors, from somebody who's been there. It's like talking to, if you were going through a divorce, or if you were going through, um, I don't know, whatever life change, you would find people who have been through that can share that with you and understand it. That's what I'm trying to do, is to provide
Mm-hmm.
that for others as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that that's great suggestions. Um, I do want to ask you, since you were a child who kind of went through the system,
Mm-hmm.
or went through that when you were a child and you were exposed to the system for a short period of time,
Mm-hmm.
if you were to reflect back on that, what would you say would have made that a much more positive experience for you? Just kind of that whole, being taken into the foster system, or, going to court and having to share, um, verbatim in front of your abuser and things like that. What do you think um, the system can do to I don't know. Maybe comfortable is the wrong word, but I'm feeling like what can they do to make that a little bit more comforting to children or folks that have gone through this?
I honestly think that a child needs to feel like they're being heard, that their opinion matters. I wasn't little. I was
Mm-hmm.
14.
Mm-hmm.
So actually being able to be talked or asked, what is it that I wanted? What is it that I would like to see happen? I don't recall, and going through the records, I don't recall or actually see in there that outside of that initial placement discussion, I was never asked again or spoken to individually again. So there's that kind of connection that I believe, particularly at a certain age, that there is an opportunity to spend more time with the child and in informing them what is actually happening, preparing them for what would potentially happen next.
Mm-hmm.
Um, None of that happened with me. It was all, just go. And there was never truly, and maybe there was, and I'm just was totally overwhelmed at the time, but I don't recall ever being sat down to say, and this is what's going to happen, and somebody will be with you. It was different people involved at each step of the way. So
Mm-hmm.
again, another stranger, another stranger. Um, so there wasn't that level of, I think we have opportunity to have somebody there that is for the child, very specifically for the child. And child advocates do that today, but
Yeah.
that wasn't the case at that point in time.
Sure, absolutely. And even then, I know that sometimes they can be very limited in scope. And again, it could be a lot of different people that are kind of have their hands in the pot, so to speak. And so you could be seeing a bunch of different people or,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of stuff. Um, okay. And so, what about from your family? What do you feel like you would have needed from your family? Um, to make
I
you
would
feel,
have
yeah.
loved for my mother to have stood up for her children that first time and truly figured out what her children needed and truly indicated that this was not acceptable behavior and to have become an ally. And that didn't happen.
Mm,
Because I think she had a responsibility to protect her children and didn't. She wasn't the perpetrator, but she had some culpability in what
sure,
happened.
absolutely. Well, I'm curious on what you say to people who there's a couple of different scenarios. You had mentioned how to say no or say that you're not ready yet when you're having sex,
Mm-hmm.
as well as, you know, if you've been victimized, I can see how you would be super concerned or overly concerned about your own children and become a helicopter parent, as you say. What are your tips and suggestions around those two issues?
So, with regard to sexual intimacy, um, some of it is it's a communication thing. Like you have to be ready. You have to know that your body is your body, and you have the right to say no at any point in time. And that if you have a loving partner that you want to be with, that you part of it is communication. It's about sharing that I'm scared, or if this happens, this is what I need from you, or
Sure.
I'm not ready for that, or whatever the situation is. And I'll give you an example of someone that actually shared a way that they handle something. So if they're with their partner and they're sitting together and they're cuddling and whatever, and he wants to kind of progress further, she had a rule that he had to take her hand. And if he was ready for more and she wasn't, she wouldn't let his hand go. And so he couldn't do anything further until she was able and ready and let his hand go. So while she wasn't able to express it, they had talked previously to the point where he understood this is the ground rules. This is what
Mm,
she needs. And if he's going to be loving with her, and this is what she needs. So it didn't progress any further until she let go of his hand. So she was in control.
Okay.
Other examples are, if you end up dissociating
Yes.
during
Very
intimacy, yeah,
common.
having a code word or having something that it's a touch or whatever it is, knowing beforehand that asking him to check in with you, as finding something on him, knowing that it's him. Like, for example, my husband had a scar, so I would keep my hand on that scar to know that that was him. But it's that kind of thing, knowing that if there's a code word and that safety word has got to be enough. Understanding that if you're having nightmares, how does he support you? What do you need? Do you want to be touched? Do you not want to be touched? Do you want the light on? Do you want the light off? What helps? So a lot of it is about communication.
Sure.
And it's about these types of strategies and having those kinds of talks that one survivor may be able to tell you, this is what has worked for me. And it may not work for somebody else, but it's these kinds of practical tips that are helpful.
Absolutely.
And then with respect to parenting, this the same kind of things, right? The suggestions that I would have are really understanding, you're always giving your children choices. So it's laying out what those choices are in a controlled environment. It's understanding from a safety perspective, where are they going? Making sure that where they're going, you know where they are. You've called ahead. If you're leaving them with the babysitter, you've checked out the babysitter. You're checking in sporadically to make sure that they're okay. You've taught your children about their own sexuality, about their body, that it's okay for them to talk with you about anything. It's a lot of it is about communication and age-appropriate communication.
Absolutely. Do you have any favorite resources that you refer to your survivors of incest?
I do. So in a place of initial healing, I still believe Ellen Bass's "The Courage to Heal" is a powerful tool. That it's 20-something years later, and it's still a very powerful tool. But aside from that, I like TED Talks. Honestly, I love Brene Brown. Her talks about shame, about vulnerability. They hit. It's not very specifically about incest survivors, but shame is such a big deal from a survivor's perspective that it just is very, very. She helps you understand.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
I also looked to. I believe that the Unique Foundation is an amazing resource as well. If you're looking for how do you help your children, Darkness to Light Foundation also has a lot of tips on parenting, about keeping children safe, about how to have these types of contact or discussions with children. So there's a lot of resources that are out there to help in the discussions and talks and making you really feel like you're not alone.
And how could people find you if they want to connect with you?
Sure. So the company that I have is called Tale of the Bell. And I grew up a math geek. So I'm an actuary professionally. And before I became a life coach, and I am still an actuary, I still work that. So it's tail, meaning the tail end of the bell curve, extreme life experiences. And you can reach out to me at info@taleofthebell through email. You can find me on Facebook under Tale of the Bell. And I also have a podcast that is very specifically for incest survivors, where incest survivors share their stories around a very specific topic. So it will be, I've done topics of dissociation and boundaries and promiscuity, the types of topics that people just are not talking about.
Sure.
Because again, what I really want survivors to know is that they're not alone, and that by putting something out there where you can hear another survivor specifically speaking around something and making that connection, I think it's very helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I can't wait to give it a listen and just hear some of what your survivors are talking about. Any upcoming projects or things that we can support you on?
So I actually am. I'm actually being featured on I'm one of 15 women. It's called The Healing Trauma. It's coming up October 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, or 2nd, 3rd, and
Oh,
4th, something like that.
pretty soon
And
then.
yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
it's 15 women over 3 days that are through a podcast. It's called Healing Trauma, and each one of them are talking about a different aspect of healing from trauma.
Mm,
I'm dealing with incest, but the other 14 are dealing with other different topics.
nice.
So I think it might be a good listen if anybody's interested.
All right, awesome. Well, I'll definitely post the links in the show notes, is what I want to say. And I just want to say thank you so very much for sharing your story and just kind of sharing your experiences and just your views on, sexual incest of children and how to recover from that or get through that or move through that, and just knowing that you're not alone. And I'm very happy to hear, although it doesn't sound like it was a positive experience overall. And I don't mean to minimize or anything like that, but I am glad that you had a sister,
Mm-hmm.
a teacher, some people that did care
Mm-hmm.
for your well-being and did the best that they could to try to look out for you. The system was very flawed, but
Mm-hmm.
it does sound like people tried to intervene, and
Yeah.
I'm glad they were there to try and do that. And I'm glad that after all this time, you've found some peace, or
Yes.
you
Yes.
made peace. Yeah.
Yeah, and well, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
First of all, I think any opportunity that we have, I think, to talk about this subject, I
Sure.
think is a good thing because it's still the taboo of the taboo, you know?
Absolutely.
So,
And thank you for coming on.
all right.
Well, that concludes today's episode of A Date with Darkness podcast. Please do reach out and let me know what your thoughts were on this show. I'm so happy that you were able to join us today. And until next time, be well.